So you are in the session of rights versus rights. This is a session that's hosted in lead partnership between the Youth and Landscapes Initiative as well as the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. So today what we're going to be stepping into is we're going to be stepping into a little bit about the complexity of being a human being and the rights that overlap with it and holding space for all of it. Now, in that spectrum, particularly relating to climate change, we do know that climate change is threatening people's guaranteed rights. It's affecting the rights to life, to health, to food, to water, and coming from a small island state myself, it affects the very right to exist. In that, and in a landscape of very conflicting priorities where the international agenda aims for lifestyles which contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, who actually is best placed to decide which peoples, which organizations, which rights come first? And we're going to be hearing and learning through stories, and we will be starting with one of the best methods of storytelling human beings have created, which is poetry, from Aka Nivana, who shared a beautiful poem as well in the opening plenary, and we'll start with that. Thank you, Aka.
Good morning. So I want to share a poem with you that is inspired by my mother. And it's an old poem, but I still feel it's relevant. I recited it at a climate march a few years back. And it's also inspired by stories we learned when we were kids about Sila, Nuna, Malina, and Sasuma Alna. That's the forces of nature. We have Sila, that is consciousness, and it's the wind. And we have Nuna, that is the land. Malina is the sun, and Sasuma Alna is the mother of the sea. Is it okay if we sit down, or do you want me to stand up? Okay. Mother Nature. Anana, kuyanak inuunang mapingang mong irinyak tsikama. Kuyanak kasasuit tungawit. Kuyanak asan ninnam. Sila, Nuna, Malina, Sasuma Alna. Forces of nature, mothers of Inuit. Dangerous if needed, if not well treated. But not as a punishment, but as a reminder. If they vanish, we do too, and there's no we without you. Sila is in everything we feel, but can't see. Nuna is the earth, including every mountain and every tree. Melt the ice in the heart of man, that's how we'll be free. Until then, we stand up. You can't ignore us, you see, because we'll be louder than the storm from the sea. We'll be stronger than the forces trying to silence me. Resistance is no game, but necessity, clearly. Anana taught me, do the right thing, scary as it might be. And don't forget, they want us gone, and a culture too. And giving up is easy, this world will help you too. But the truths they're hiding will eventually show. And I hope it's not too late when we'll finally know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aka. And I just invite maybe just to take a few seconds to let that poem to sit with you for a moment. Julia, welcome. So we're going to be starting with interventions and maybe 5 minutes, 6 minutes each. And each of the experts here will be sharing their experiences of an example where the rights of one group has clashed with the rights of another group. When the intentionality has been when both have been looking for the common good and talking about that entrance into that. And we'll start with Julia Gota from Gaia and GIZ, and then we'll go around.
Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Julia, and I'm really glad to see you here, that you joined this session to reflect on your rights and the rights of others, and where those rights may maybe interfere. So I was lucky to have the chance to do research in one of the most diverse agro-ecosystems that are home gardens. I spent 4 months living in an indigenous village in the southeast of Mexico, studying the food plants in home gardens. And home gardens in Mexico are maybe not what you think of a garden when you do not live in the tropics. So there's no raised beds and no salad that is planted neatly in rows. But it's rather an agroforestry system that gives a rather chaotic impression at the first glance. So from ground creeping plants to tall trees, there are a lot of niches that host a large variety of plants and animals. They are also places for experimentation and domestication, and a refuge for wild species, where the landscapes around are turning from tropical rainforest to arable land and finally into grassland. So we all know what a crucial role biodiversity is playing in sustaining life on Earth, and biodiversity itself being life. And the reduction in agrobiodiversity we are seeing is placing us in an increasingly vulnerable position. So about 75% of the world's food is generated from only 12 plant and 5 animal species. And the gardens that I had the chance to visit, they harbored up to 55 edible plant species, and that only in one single garden. But what is very important to know is that in order to conserve this biodiversity, it's only possible through the use. So when plants are used and cared for, and their seeds kept and resown, that's how you conserve this biodiversity. So I was seeing those home gardens as paradise, no? An organic supermarket with lots of regional and seasonal food. I could not stop eating mangoes, avocados, guava, coconuts, preparing orange juice, lemonades, or just discovering plants that I did not even know of yet. And I also realized that it's not necessarily what local people see in their gardens. So the food plants from home gardens, they are competing with food that comes in shiny, colorful packaging, that is praised on television, that maybe your favorite actress is eating on this huge commercial banner you saw last week in town, or just with food that you can buy, which shows that you have money to afford it. So maybe, for example, chaya, or leafy vegetable that was already on the plates of your ancestors. It might be your favorite plant, or you might feed it to your pigs and poultry. I was seeing a lot of wild chili growing in the gardens, and at the same time, people buying chili from the market in the city. And I was seeing yam, taro, sweet potato that you could use in chicken soup, and people buying potatoes for the same purpose. I saw a lot of oranges to prepare orange juice, and people buying the Coke at the neighbor's shop. I saw fruits perishing on the ground, and at the same time, people eating vitamin pills. I saw a lot of coffee plants, and at the same time, people drinking Nescafe. So why is it difficult, or seems difficult for some people to value what they have in their gardens and to prefer what they are grown themselves over what they can buy? And I think in part it's about being proud of who you are, your culture and history you're sharing with your people. On how you see yourself, what is your self-conception, and whether you are proud of consuming traditional food or you don't want to identify with this poor man's food. I like the message of yesterday's I See a Different You at the Changing the Narrative session, of the importance of telling your own story. And I think this is quite important in this place, the place that I got to know. So we want to protect and conserve biodiversity, in the end for the best of for all. But sometimes you want other people to conserve it. and those people maybe prefer to live their own lifestyle with all the commodities that the modern world is offering. They have the right to choose their way of living and the food they consume. And I have the right to advocate for conserving biodiversity. But do I have the right to expect them to conserve the diversity of food plants in their home gardens?
Half a day and good morning, everyone. My name is Rosario Perez, and I am from an island in the Pacific called Guam. Its original name is Guahan, which means we have in the native language, but it was changed to Guam because the Americans couldn't say it. Oh, I forgot to mention too. Guam is a United States unincorporated territory, so I get that would be a great segue into my story. Let's see. I like to say that Guam is a U.S. citizen, or people in Guam are U.S. citizens. I got here because I had a U.S. passport, but I like to say that we're U.S. citizens with conditional rights. And there's this very incredibly long and dense document called the Organic Act that allows or gives permission for the indigenous people or just any resident of Guam to have these conditional rights, as I like to say. And okay, so I guess what I could start with is there are always two sides to a story, and I'll tell my side of the story first, or at least I'll provide context. Guam has had a very long colonial history. Even to date, we are still a colony. We've had 300 years of the Spanish colonization and even more with the American colonization to date. Guam is about 210 square miles, I think that's right. The population is roughly 160,000. And in this small island, the US military occupies a third of our island. And because of the Organic Act, there's verbiage in it that allows for the military to condemn land when they see needed. And so they didn't always occupy such a wide spread of our island, but I think as time passed, they thought it was important to get even more land and even more land and even more land. And so I think it was stagnant for just a short time, but it's kind of picked up again. And the military has decided to condemn land that is, one, it's called Letekzen, but for people who can't say it, it's Ritidian. On Letekzen is very sacred historical land for the indigenous Chamorro people. There are thousands of archaeological sites there with remains and pottery, all of which should be preserved. We even have laws that say that it's a crime, it's a federal crime to touch and tamper with artifacts. Okay, so we have the ancestral and the sacred part. For people who are not Chamorro, it's relevant to them in that underneath this land is where Guam gets 80% of their water. We have a natural aquifer system because our island is mainly made of limestone forest. And that water, again, provides 80% of the island with their water. On top of that, it is also, I forgot to mention that it's like 1,000 acres of limestone forest. And to me, I think it's very obvious why that's very problematic. So the military wants to take this land, and they want to take it to build a firing range. And in this projected project, there's going to be roughly 1.8 billion bullets fired and released, I want to say in about a year. Yeah. So there's also the potential for lead poisoning in our water. So my side of the story, I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's totally unsustainable. I think it's really just all in all a bad idea. And I think it infringes on a countless numbers of rights. We would not have access to any water, because once that water becomes contaminated, we become even more dependent on the United States to import water, when we had a perfectly natural, beautiful system already existing. So then, again, that's my side of the story, and I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible, which I think is impossible. And then there's the military side. We have had US officials, the US military officials, come out and say, no, this is actually really great for conservation and preservation. And I'm like, okay, how so? I'll hear you out. And this is in a public media outlet, and this is, wait, let me get my phone so I have the correct verbiage here. Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay, so I was planning to say the person's name, but maybe for the sake of confidentiality, I won't. So this is a military official's quote, and this is their perception on building the firing range. So the person says, if you want to protect cultural resources, one of the best ways to do it is to put a firing range down on it. And then he says, I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I'm like, it doesn't sound counterintuitive. I think it is counterintuitive. But again, that's my side. And I have come to respect the fact that even though it makes perfect sense to me, it might not to them. And, you know, the funny thing, and that's what I want to mention, is I think the funny thing is that I don't think that was sarcastic. I don't think that was ironic. I think maybe they genuinely believe that. I mean, who knows? You know, we never really know people's intentions. We always just want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're going to be honest about their perspectives. So to tie it back to the theme, we have the Chamorro people who see that it's unsustainable and that it infringes on their rights. But then we have the U.S. military who they have this legal document that says that they can do whatever they want in our land, and it infringes in their rights. So you can see that the conflict of interest and that it's very multiple layered. But thank you for letting me tell my story.
Next, we have Janine Yazi, who's a representative from the Indigenous Peoples Major Group.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I feel like everyone's kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed this morning, just like me. But thank you for showing up to our session. I was really interested when I got invited to this session about all the different layers that could be impacted in this conversation. Because being Indigenous and being a woman, this conflict of rights, or this conversation about rights versus rights is a part of our daily lives, because our rights are always in conflict with the institutions of power that are in place. And there's just like so many examples that were popping up of like real-time cases right now that are going through our court systems in the U.S., such as like the Indian Child Welfare Act, and whether or not that's going to be renewed and kept in place, because there's this big push to. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is a law that was created to stop the outside adoption of Indigenous children, because it was happening through this pipeline of removing Indigenous children from their homelands. And so this act was created to put protections in place so that Indigenous children were first and foremost placed at least with their tribe, if not with their own community, and with extended members of their family, as a way to stop this theft of Indigenous children from their communities. But right now there's a conflict because, and it's used from a legal perspective, I think kind of hypocritically, from a state that never became signatories to the rights of the child, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, where they're now saying that it's the right of children to be adopted anyway and to be placed with families, and this act is preventing placement of those children in loving and comfortable homes. Other ongoing struggles are around water rights, especially in the Southwest. The priority of states in how do we deal with the endemic drought and the impacts of climate change and water scarcity in a very uncertain future is to settle the water rights of tribes. And in all of these cases, the settlement and the process by which you litigate, the rules by which you litigate your claim to water resources are written to disadvantage the claims of tribal nations that are there. And it becomes complicated with their legalese and how they force you in determining what is your right of your people from now and into eternity, and in terms of how much water you can use from common resources, right? And in these conflicts, the tribes are often sitting and fighting for their rights with other multiple stakeholders, corporations, private landholders, states, regional organizations who are also trying to ascertain their rights to this quote-unquote public good. There's the long legacy of conservation rights coming into conflict with Indigenous peoples' rights in many different ways, and the use especially in the areas of hunting rights and in the use of traditional territories that get slated for conservation. And that's going to be very interesting in how that comes up in this very growing, this conversation that's growing in popularity around the rights of nature. Because all of these conflicts come down to who is defining what is the greater good or what is the common good. And I think that often gets not enough attention in understanding these arguments, because there's always someone that is defining what is the greater good that is at stake, and there's always assumptions and biases in that definition that privilege certain groups over others. I think one of the most valuable lessons I ever learned was from a former CIA agent who said, out of all of their years of experience in dealing with all these conflicts in different countries, the thing that they learned the most was that everyone thinks they're the good guy. And that always stuck with me, because I you see these tensions and these conflicts of these conversations that are really hard to resolve, and that's usually what's happening, is that everyone thinks they're the good guy no matter what position they're standing on. Right now, how that gets taught me to kind of approach in a different way when these conflicts arise, by starting with that question, why do the people on these opposite sides think they're the good guy, or these stakeholders think they're the good guy, and what kind of logic is going into that argument. And it's helping right now in the development of a new policy for my nation around genetic research. And I'm part of a working group that's taking this on, because there's a lot of pressure right now to get Indigenous peoples to open themselves up in their territories to genetic research, because there's a lot of money being circulated around this field of research. And in every presentation that I've seen to our tribal leaders and to our communities to convince us of the benefits of this participation, it is packaged as, this is the best possible action you could take for the good for all. Because the extraction of genetic research is supposed to inform the development of new medicines, the development of new scientific breakthroughs that will benefit all peoples. But the reason why they're targeting Indigenous peoples' lands and territories, as well as human subjects, is because we have not participated in a wide scale in genetic research globally. And because of the dearth of our lack of our genetic material, there's a huge gap in how they understand a lot of the things that are emerging from genetic research. And they want to fill that gap by starting to extract DNA from Indigenous populations at a large scale to better understand the profile of the human genome. And so in this conversation, it's really interesting to see how this is being, there's growing groups who are very interested and very invested in developing these policies under this guise that it will be good for all humanity, all mankind, if people just participated and like just do it because this like we're going to get benefits from this. And so the danger is, though, in all of these cases, is that the logic doesn't go far enough or deep enough to really ensure that the way we're looking at our rights is I can't find the words for it, but it doesn't go deep enough to really understand if that definition of the good for all really is egalitarian, or if it's based in self-interest. And so an example of this is that in our workshops with these genetic researchers and policymakers who are pushing this agenda, we took all of the stakeholders in a room and broke down good for all and made them define more deeply what did they mean by good. And what do they mean by for? By which mechanisms are they transferring those benefits of the good to all of the stakeholders in the room? And then what was their definition for all? And in most cases, and like with our water rights, with the rights and conservation conflicts, and now with this new conversation about the rights of nature, good and the way people define good is very different, even though they're using the same language in these conversations. And the way people think of for all is very human-centered and very limited in what they're thinking the benefits need to be for the human stakeholders in this. And in none of these conversations is there a consciousness of the greater inherent rights of all sacred life and all living beings and all sacred elements to guide or to root us to something much deeper than just our own human interests, because we're biased as well, right? And because of just like the inherent power dynamics that are built into our legal mechanisms, our political structures, and all of these institutions that are established to quote unquote protect and enforce rights as they are articulated, we're always going to be put into conflict. But we have to work past these conflicts for a greater understanding of what is the intention of the people who are sitting on both sides, and how can we take those intentions and actually dig deeper to something that goes beyond the self-interests of the parties that are in these conflicts. Because if not, we're going to continue to create laws, especially with this conversation around the rights of nature. We're going to continue to create laws that aren't truly egalitarian and that actually don't help us as human societies reach the goals that we need to reach in terms of creating the institutions and creating the solutions that are necessary to restore the balance that we need so desperately in our world. And so I look forward to having the conversation with everyone else about, just your experiences with all of this and this conflict. But thank you so much for having me.
Next, we'll be going to Rayan Thansa from the Youth Amazon Indigenous activist, who will be also sharing her story.
Hola, buenos días a todos y todas.
Okay, so we're going to be doing translation. Rayan speaks Spanish, and I will be doing the translation to English. She greets everyone.
No, la verdad es, hablo portugués.
En realidad habla portugués.
Bien, mi nombre es Rayan, soy del pueblo Baré, de la Amazonía de Brasil.
Mi nombre es Rayan, soy del pueblo Baré, de la... Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Rayan. I am from the Baré people of the Amazonian Basin in Brazil.
Tengo 27 años y hago parte de la red de jóvenes indígenas de Brasil, Rejuin.
I am 27 years old and I am part of the network of indigenous people of Brazil.
Y también hago parte de la red de jóvenes indígenas de América Latina y Caribe, donde también tenemos una red que es a nivel regional de América Latina.
I am also part of the youth network of indigenous youth from Latin America and the Caribbean, which is more of a regional network.
Bien, creo que cuando vamos a hablar de pueblos indígenas, la primera cosa que debemos pensar son en derechos. Al mismo tiempo que pensamos en derechos, pensamos en violaciones.
So the first thing that we need to speak of when we speak of indigenous people is rights. And when we think of rights, we think of how they're violated.
Bien, mi historia empieza como parte del movimiento indígena o como parte actuante del movimiento indígena cuando yo tenía 15 años.
So the story begins as I got involved in the indigenous movement for youth when I was 15.
Cuando yo tenía que empezar a participar de los espacios que muchas veces para mí yo pensaba que no debería estar.
When I had to be in places and spaces where I thought that I shouldn't be.
Cuando yo tenía más o menos 13 años, mi familia, mi papá es un liderazgo en la Amazonía y cuando yo tenía como 12, 13 años, mi familia pasó por un proceso de persecución de líderes indígenas.
So when I was 13, my dad was a leader, and around when I was 12, 13, our people were persecuted.
Y para mí, como joven, yo pensaba, yo no quiero tener la misma vida que mi papá, no quiero vivir una vida de persecución, de violaciones, de tener una familia en riesgo siempre.
And as I was young, I thought, I don't want to have the same life as my father. I don't want to be persecuted. I don't want my rights to continue to be violated.
Con pasar de los años, tuvo que estudiar y salir de la Amazonía como una situación de seguridad también, para que no estuviera en riesgo también como estaba mi familia, y me fui a Brasilia.
So with the passage of time, in order to avoid this, I went out to study. I left the Amazon, I went to Brasilia.
Y bien, cuando llegué en la ciudad de Brasilia, porque es una situación muy diferente, el choque cultural que tenemos, porque una cosa es mi vida en la Amazonía y otra cosa es una vida en la ciudad grande como Brasilia, que es la capital de Brasil.
So that was a very big cultural shock for me, to come from my life in the Amazon to the life in the capital of Brazil.
Entonces, se fue muy complicado y al mismo tiempo que yo empezaba a conocer otros espacios, también conocía otras cosas, otras culturas, otras identidades, pero también conocí el preconcepto, discriminación, la verdad, racismo y todos los otros medios que nosotros en cuanto a pueblos indígenas siempre pasamos, pero en la Amazonía no pasaba esto, porque estaba con mi familia, estaba con los demás indígenas, pero en Brasilia no tenías indígenas, entonces todos los días tenía que hacer una afirmación de mi identidad.
So as I got to know new cultures and new identities, I also encountered with discrimination and racism, something that didn't happen to me back in the Amazon, because in the Amazon I had my family. So this caused that every day I would have to reassure my identity.
Entonces, cuando menos esperaba, ya estaba a frente del movimiento indígena, de los estudiantes indígenas de Brasilia, y ya estaba siguiendo la misma vida de mi papá. Cuando me vi, ya estaba también en la otra zona de riesgo.
So when I started to lead the movement of the indigenous student youth, I found I was in the same place as my father.
Y bien, y por eso les digo, porque hablar de pueblos indígenas es hablar de violaciones, porque todos los días, para reafirmar nuestras identidades, tenemos que como hacer una comprobación para la sociedad. No solamente podemos decir, yo soy indígena, tengo que decir por qué soy indígena, o qué me hace indígena, dónde salió la palabra indígena.
So we have to, with this violation of rights, we have to claim over and over again our identity as indigenous to the rest of society. we have to ask ourselves, why are we indigenous? What does it mean to be indigenous? And yeah, that's what we have to do to society.
Bien, y entonces por eso que cuando comentamos este dualismo de entre la tradicionalidad y la modernidad, el acceso a los servicios y decir quién está hablando de derecho para quién, estamos siempre nos poniendo a ese tipo de situación.
So we think of this dualism between traditional and modernity. Tradicionalismo y modernidad.
Siempre nos ponemos en esas situaciones de decir por qué tenemos que tener derechos.
So in this dualism between traditional and modernity, we have to ask ourselves, why do we have these rights?
Entonces por ahí ya pasamos por el otro momento, el momento de los conflictos, porque la sociedad que estamos hoy, el propio Estado, en el caso de Brasil, se pone en una línea de frente que está dispuesta a atacar a todos los derechos de los pueblos indígenas.
So this is where we come to conflict, because the state now in Brazil is up to violating the rights of all indigenous people.
Porque hoy en Brasil tenemos más o menos 1 millón de personas indígenas.
Because now in Brazil we have around 1 million indigenous people.
Pero somos 305 pueblos diferentes.
But we are 305 different people.
Y tenemos 274 idiomas indígenas.
And 274 indigenous languages.
Entonces, somos una diversidad de pueblos y al mismo tiempo, por ser una diversidad de pueblos, también tenemos muchos conflictos de identidades, de interculturalidades, del modo de pensar, de vivir en nuestros territorios.
So because we have such a big diversity of people, we also have a lot of conflict of different views, different lifestyles, different traditions.
Por ejemplo, en la Amazonía estamos pasando por un proceso muy complicado, muy extremo, porque estamos llegando a niveles de deforestación muy grandes, muy largas, y sabemos que todo eso ya se pasaba en los gobiernos anteriores que tuvimos en Brasil, pero ahora está se quedando muy peor.
So right now in the Amazon, we're going through a phase of a very violent deforestation. But this is not something new. It's something that has already been happening before.
Y por ejemplo, ahora con este nuevo gobierno, está poniendo a los pueblos indígenas uno contra los otros, diciendo quién es más indígena, quién es menos indígena, utilizando de mecanismos como, por ejemplo, si mi pelo, soy amazónica, entonces mi pelo si es negro, si mis ojos son un poco más cerrados, si mi piel es un poco más negra, entonces yo soy el verdadero modelo de indígena.
So right now, in this context, the government of Brazil is putting us indigenous people against each other, trying to show who is more Amazonian, who is more indigenous. So if my hair is darker, if my eyes are a certain shape, then I'm the truly Amazonian.
Entonces, y por esa diversidad, estamos pasando por todo ese tipo de conflictos, porque ya sabemos que tenemos una identidad, tenemos una historia, pasamos por procesos de violaciones a más de 500 años.
So, because of this diversity, we have these conflicts between us, but we all have been through a series of conflicts, of violations of our rights.
Bien, eso nos toca en cuanto jóvenes, porque nos preocupa que estamos perdiendo nuestras culturas, nuestra tradicionalidad, pero sabemos que no podemos vivir la existencia de nuestros pueblos, la continuidad de nuestras vidas, no está dependiente solamente de nuestra cultura o nuestra tradición.
So this is why here we come to the youth. For youth, it's very important to maintain our identity as we go forward. Yeah?
Okay. Entonces ahora estamos pasando por un proceso que es el proceso de desplazamiento. Estamos saliendo de nuestras comunidades, adentrando en los espacios en las universidades, por ejemplo, porque yo costumo decir que el gobierno, el Estado, siempre nos mató con sus plumas, con sus polígrafos. Y nosotros, pueblos indígenas, antiguamente moríamos por enfermedad. Hoy moríamos por sus polígrafos.
Okay. So now we are being displaced from our homes because we have to go study. So what I like to say is that before we were being displaced by sus armas, sus guns. ¿Por qué los están desplazando? ¿Por sus armas, dijiste? ¿Y ahora por los bolígrafos?
No, ahora estamos pasando por un proceso de desplazamiento, estamos buscando las universidades,
Sí.
también como hacer parte de esa sociedad.
Okay, so before they were displacing us more with violent means like guns, but now they're displacing us through pens, because now we have this idea that we have to go to university and that we have to belong to this society.
Porque estar en los espacios de la academia, estar en los espacios de la universidad, también es un espacio de empoderamiento para los pueblos indígenas. Y sabemos que a través de la educación es los espacios donde podemos cambiar el modelo de desarrollo que está poniendo hoy.
Because we acknowledge through this that with academic positions, like with studying, we have more power. So this is something that now we acknowledge that we have to take part in.
Y ahora pasamos por ese proceso, y un proceso que se ha avanzado en los últimos años con algunas políticas públicas y otros programas de acceso a los estudiantes indígenas en los espacios de las universidades, por ejemplo.
So now we're going through this when we are making new spaces for indigenous people within the universities.
Entonces ahora tenemos abogados indígenas, médicos, enfermeros. Por ejemplo, yo soy enfermera por formación.
Now we have indigenous lawyers, we have indigenous doctors, we have nurses. I am a nurse by profession.
Y eso para nosotros es muy importante porque ya tenemos todos los conflictos simplemente por ser indígena. Pero ahora estamos nos empoderando y diciendo, estamos vivos, sabemos de nuestros derechos y vamos atrás de nuestros derechos.
So through this we are empowering ourselves because we can say that we know our rights and that now we're going to go after our rights.
Y lo más importante, porque estamos poniendo en los espacios de los pesquisadores, de los espacios académicos, el espacio científico, que nuestra cultura, nuestra identidad, nuestra medicina tradicional es conocimiento y debe ser reconocida por toda una sociedad.
So now we are having a place in the academic world by showing that our traditional medicine, our traditional knowledge is knowledge and that it needs to be recognized in the world.
Bien, yo podría hablar mucho más, pero por el proceso de traducción creo que es un poco más complicado. Y bien, les agradezco por estar en ese espacio y también y decir que estamos, en cuanto a pueblos indígenas, estamos juntos en toda esa lucha y que siempre debemos estar juntos y no dejar ningún para atrás.
Okay, so I could say much more, but because of the translation, it's best that I leave it at this. But I just want to tell you that I'm happy that we're here and that as indigenous people, we have to stand together as we go on this. We are the same and we should do this together.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Asafa Tofu, who's the director of Dry Dev Program from World Vision Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Asafa from Ethiopia, working currently for World Vision and also doing some other national and some international activities. Let me start with my story, and I'm happy to be part of this youth group, and I'm 50 years old, having with three children, and I'm happy to, when I'm being among my children, I'm happy, so that's great to be, and I think now I'm taking back to the youth. Anyway, Academically, I did my first degree in agriculture, second degree on plant breeding and genetics, and the final degree on environment management. And in the development, in the career path, I started my career as a researcher, agriculture researcher in Ethiopia. And in that case, I've been doing different research activities, sometimes as a director. And going to the ground in Ethiopia and Africa, the problems are too many, not really one issue. Because one family is facing water issue, education issue, food issue, and a number of things. The issues are too many. So along my research career, I said, okay, what can I do? So being as a one discipline-oriented researcher, what would be my contribution? So that has been challenging me, and then I decided to, okay, let me leave the research and join the development. And the reason I want to join is how one development component can address at least top 3, 4, 5 priority of one household, instead of dealing on one discipline and producing paper and getting salary and doing personal welfare. So that's a decision I made, and then I joined World Vision and I started working on food security, environment, climate change. And in 2006, I think I had an opportunity to pilot the afforestation, reforestation, clean development mechanism, the first project in Ethiopia, maybe the biggest in Africa, and which is get registered at UNFCCC. Along my career also, I was opportune to help the country government and in the country and outside the country and across the climate change negotiation path. I was up to Copenhagen with the head of state and how we can fix the climate change challenge. Actually, the climate change challenge is a real challenge because I grew up in the village farming community where food was surplus, water was surplus, the land fertility was very good, vegetation was very good, and particularly in my area, people and also livestock, nobody is suffering except surplus. But by my age now, 50 years, and there are a lot of success stories, but to me, practically, the challenge is increasing than the success, particularly in many parts of the world, including the developed countries. So that needs, I think, a number of effort, because go back to my home, my 3 children, my wife, myself, if we are not doing this good thing together, my family will not be standing. So to me, this planet is one family. This planet Earth is one family. So we all are responsible to do good thing and to make this planet suitable for everyone. And we are not permanent also on this planet. As a generation, we came, we go. And we took something good thing from our 4 families, and we are on the way to hand over what we have, whether that is success or that is a reality. And it's good to face reality. And when we are facing realities, there are some things that people have been misunderstanding. And I'm also asking myself, okay, where we came, how this planet has been created. So to me, according to the Bible, the first verse, Genesis 1, in the Bible it is stated that God created the heaven and earth. It has been created by God. That's the way I believe and the way and not only created. In Genesis 2:15, God commanded a man, put a man into Eden, and asked a man to protect and to dress the heaven, the earth. So to me, that is the origin. And that is the origin, or we as a human being has to respect. We are created to protect and dress the earth. If we protect and dress the earth, that earth can help us. Otherwise, it will be against us. So I think to me, that's what's happening. So number one, we need to understand where is the origin and how it has come up to this level, and where are we going, and what has been a mistake, and what has been good thing. So what has to be done? So let me start some good story. I think many of us, we know that there has been recently, 1980, there is industrial revolution, which was successful globally. And followed by industrial revolution, there has been also green revolution. In case of India and others, the food security issue has been overthrown. And after green, there are different revolutions, but I don't want to go to each other. But currently, there is also technology revolution, which is happening, which is going on. Things are happening, but to me, one of the challenges still not reversed is that the climate, which is the land, the water, and the vegetation, this issue is still an issue. And to me, is it not possible to solve? It is possible to me, because I think as a human being, we are the superior nature among all the creatures. So if we are superior, we have a superior capacity or superior capability to solve the existing challenge, because a number of challenges has happened and that has been sorted out. But the land, water, vegetation challenge, it is still doable thing. But how it can be? So that needs, to me, coordination, honest coordination, and execution, and also keep on building good thing and filling the gap which was not done. So I believe from my career, as well as also from my different exposures, that there is a rare opportunity to go shortcut. There are a number of things which are logically ordered or sequenced. So how that logically sequenced can be worked out? So recently I've been working, as he said, on dry land development program in Ethiopia. And what we are doing on that one is that in Ethiopia, around 80% of the country is more of mountainous area, not flat like Europe or America, or even the Sahel. So that mountainous area the water is coming from that mountain. Given the Ethiopian population now crossing 100 million, they need water, and they need air, they need food. So from that mountainous area, the mountainous area is highly exposed for runoff, erosion, and number of degradations. So it needs its context-specific application of technology and development. So one of the approach which has been adopted in the country, and myself also, we are also passionate on that, is that watershed-based development. It is not only watershed, because the watershed has to be also sequentially implemented. Because if the watershed, the top is on the 2,000 meters above sea level, and the downstream is 1,200 meters above sea level, within maybe 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers, that whatever happening on the top of the mountain is affecting the downstream. So it has to be sequentially worked out. And sequentially, how do we can sequence? There is naturally, the sequence is there. There is physically, the sequence is there. Socially also, there is a sequencing is important. So that is working out? Yes, it has been working out. Like in 5 years, in the sequentially integrated watershed development, what we achieved was, it was published, and there are a lot of reports on, I can share you the report. So we managed to double a productivity of a unit area in 5 years. We reduced hunger months by half in 5 years. We increased, practically we have got a result, doubling of income of each farmer in 5 years, and the doubling of expenditure. That happened because of the doubling of the water availability on that particular area, because of doubling the soil fertility of that particular area, and because of doubling or more the capacity of that particular area, or I can say human as well as also landscape transformation. So to me, it is very important to check where is the origin, how things has been happening, where things are going, and checking where is the mistake, how that mistake can be corrected. As I said, maybe to me, there is no shortcut. Some of the things like this kind of thing, there are sequential order which has to be worked out. And it is possible to work out because the nature is, to me, one of the best thing which will not account what bad thing we did before. Because if we reverse what we have been doing, the nature is ready to correct itself and to supplement, to complement or to help all of us. So finally, I want to say, I think as a youth and as a human being, we need to have action. Individual action is very, very important, and that has to be coordinated as much as possible, and that has to be documented and shared, not only at a government level. To me, each and every household as a family, we are responsible for this planet. In my family, I'm responsible. My children are responsible. My wife, we are responsible. So if we all take that responsibility at home, at an individual level, at a family level, at a country level, and the continental and the global level, to me, the existing problem is really a problem which has many solutions. So with this, I want to stop here, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Next, we invite Diego de Leon, who's a senior climate advisor for the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also, I want to congratulate the GLF because this is a mostly female panel. That doesn't happen very often, and it should be definitely celebrated. I'm very glad to see this. So I'm currently a foreign climate advisor for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but the story that I want to share is when I was the Foreign Affairs Director for a state, it's a regional government in Mexico called Jalisco. It's the second largest economy of the country, and I was fortunate enough to be leading or coordinating their international affairs agenda back in the day. And I want to talk about a very specific case where, there were right versus rights. And I'll try to be brief so we can keep the conversation. And of course, I would love to hear your comments and questions, and of course, to have a healthy conversation with the rest of the speakers. So in 2008, so the Jalisco has the largest water body in Mexico called the Lake of Chapala, which is fed by two rivers, Lerma Santiago and the Rio Verde, the Green River. So the Lerma Santiago, it's already a very exploited water body, and it's also been susceptible to a lot of industrial pollution. So the other alternative is to have the Rio Verde. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but in order to capitalize on that resource, the government decided in 2005 to build a dam to concentrate the water and feed a region in the state of Jalisco where the two rivers cross, which is called Los Altos. This region is very important because it's the largest agricultural producing region in Mexico. So, and as a cultural note, it's also where tequila is, the plant, the agave, is where it's cultivated. So it has a lot, it is a very important economic force in the country. And therefore, quick solutions were needed in order to supply the water for this region. Bear in mind that this is an arid region, so the water is scarce, and therefore, it's and for agriculture, it's required in larger amounts. So, you have a really big agricultural industry, a growing industry, which supplied the jobs, the majority of the jobs in the region. And since there was no way of exploiting the water in the Rio Verde, They are still relying on underground water, but as for right now, 100% of the water reserves are already overexploited. So the government decides, okay, let's build this dam, and then it's set to have a certain measurement, 80 meters. And in 2008, they realized that that is not going to be enough, so they have to rise the curtain of the dam by 25 meters, so from 80 to 105. However, by rising that, 3 local communities will be flooded. And these are communities that have a lot of historical value, as well as natural value. There's some hot springs there. These are populations that have been living there before the 17th century. So there's this social conflict of what's going to happen. In Mexico, there's this legal figure called amparo, which is very hard to translate, but the best word that I found was kind of a safeguard, that any person that feels that they are being judged unfairly, or that they, if you committed a crime, you can say, well, I want to apply my right for a safeguard, and then you go into a legal process that basically delays the trial until the safeguard is resolved. So these people applied the safeguard, and the dam project was halted. So and it could not continue until the government resolved what they're going to do with this safeguard. A lot of stakeholders came into place, especially the community leaders, religious leaders. Also, it became a very political issue. A lot of politicians started capitalizing on this issue and dividing, so those who supported, those who were against. And this, we're talking about 2008, so it's been about 10 years. But as for this case, I'm talking about specifically around 2014, when in 2012, there was elections, a new governor takes power, and he decides that he wants to try to resolve this issue. Also here, as a note, it is also in the different levels of government. So water management in Mexico, it's managed by the federal government. So all the water projects are managed by the federal government, but in this case, the affected communities are at the municipal level, and the ones that would have to be in charge of their relocation and their all the process would be the state government. So you're also interacting different levels of government, which adds a new level of complexity to the problem. So the governor comes, and he says, well, we're going to try to resolve this. We have a meeting, and he's like, well, international affairs, what can we do? So we decided to call the UN. We thought that they had the technical knowledge, as well as the moral representation enough to be truly independent and impartial in this situation. So we called the United Nations Office for Project Services, UNOPS, and the United Nations Environmental Program, and we told them, help us understand the situation. So the first thing that we identified is, okay, there is no water, we call it hydric balance analysis, which is basically how much water do we really have and how much water are we gonna need in the next coming years. So the Mexican government does this analysis as part of a routine, study, but we discovered that the Mexican government was not taking into account climate change. So we used the knowledge and technology of the UN to really understand what was the water problem, and the results were very worrying because we were basically on a route of our agricultural collapse. So based on that information, we said, well, we really do need to find a solution for this water problem. And also, so the second part of the project was creating social dialogues led by the UN to try to engage all the stakeholders and try to find a solution that would have the proper consent of the local communities. unfortunately, there is a very high level of mistrust among all the stakeholders. And as I mentioned, a lot of politicians capitalize on this issue to move forward on their political agendas. So unfortunately, the project, and sometimes they fail. And recognize at the end, the project is still on a halt. Climate change is advancing. The Los Altos region is one of the most vulnerable areas to climate change, and we have not been able to find a solution. I wish I had a more positive story, but sometimes it's also important to talk about failure, because we learn sometimes more from failure than from actual success. So I'm going to leave it there. Of course, I'm open for questions, comments, and of course, link all our stories with the other panelists. This is I tried to find a very, very concrete example of right versus right, but also very in the ground kind of concrete example. But that's my story. So glad to answer any question.
Thank you very much to you. Just in the interest of time, I will jump directly to your questions and also inviting you to share your own stories. So we have heard stories of where maybe sort of two rights are competing with each other or seemingly pushed and put against each other. So if you have stories to share about your own personal experiences in your work, you're sort of welcome to do so, but also immediate reflections and questions for the stories that were shared here.
Good morning, and thanks for sharing your testimonies, your stories, your failures, and successful stories as well. I have two questions for Rosario, Jenny, and your name, I'm sorry, I forgot. Tu nombre, lo siento, Diane. About if your governments or local governments has made any effort for including some indigenous or traditional knowledge in educational programs content. I mean, if in schools or in places where young people or children go to study, can have both part of the conventional education. Yeah, because then I would like to share something about, because I'm from Peru, and also in some regions of Peru, the government has included some content related to traditional knowledge in terms of supporting indigenous communities there.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for the very inspiring and for sharing with us your stories. It's very touchy, and I was just thinking a bit behind. So some of you mentioned as well that it's important to create an internal dialogue among you in different indigenous communities. So what I'm interested on is, if you're talking about rights, so how do you internally communicate? You mentioned these genetic resources activities that you would like to do. You mentioned the water management that you are carrying in your local community. So how do you communicate internally? Because I mean, if we have to act on the ground, how do you build this line? Because you are the voice of them, all right? I understood, and I really appreciate it. This is important for us to know what happened there in places that are probably far from us. But how do you create this dialogue with them? How do you build the trust? And what are the challenges for that? Because if we need to move forward, how do we create a connection as well with them that is still like it's working and it's not in conflict or not creating additional issues actually?
Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So first to your question about traditional knowledge and education, it's not quite mainstreamed into our educational systems, and so we have as a tribal nation, both schools that are run by our tribe, but also a lot of public schools that fall under the authorities of the state are the federal, and we also still have federal boarding schools. So there's like those 3 levels of schools. For our own tribes, we have the intention of incorporating traditional knowledge systems into the curriculum and like the educational content for all of our youth. But the main focus has to first start with language and language revitalization, because there's this barrier to the transference of knowledge of our traditional knowledge when the youth don't speak the language that the elders need to speak to communicate and in a deeper way what that knowledge is. And so that our own schools are taking that initiative to try to incorporate language programs. But as far as the state and the public schools, everything is structured around meeting certain criteria and certain like testing standards that they don't see the value or the need to invest in that type of curriculum change. But in the midst of this, because both of those are kind of inadequate when we're talking about the situation that we're in and the tools we need to give our younger people to deal with all of these changes and the power of traditional knowledge to give them those tools, a lot of young people have created their own schools that are outside of those structures and those institutions. There's schools that promote empowerment and knowledge, schools that promote all these cultural teachings and that use experiential learning methods so that the students aren't necessarily being sat down and instructed to. They're a part of. They have these pathways to be a part of the activities that are based on traditional knowledge. And I think that's very powerful. And it actually goes back to how do you communicate internally and like your second question, because it's about doing those actions together. You know, like a lot of times people are like, we gotta have dialogue, but you can only get to a certain level of understanding when you're just talking with each other, when you're working with each other, when you're creating spaces with each other, like co-creating spaces with each other. I think that's where you get to the level of communication where you build that trust. But you also have to be consistent in that. And so internally for what we do with all of our issues is, we work on watershed projects too, and bringing stakeholders like that together into these shared spaces. It really is working together to think about where are we going, right? And taking time to really have that conversation so that everyone has a say and you get to like your real intention about where you're going. But then also ensuring that you're being consistent enough in that conversation that you're building the type of values and the type of protocols that are necessary to really listen and value everyone's input and respond to it.
Bien, en Brasil tenemos un sistema propio de educación escolar indígena, educación primaria indígena.
In Brazil, we have our own system of primary indigenous school education,
Que es específico para los pueblos indígenas, donde tenemos la escuela primaria, donde trabajamos los idiomas indígenas, porque también vale comentar que este año estamos en el año internacional de las lenguas indígenas.
So in this primary education, we teach children the indigenous languages, and I just want to emphasize that this year is the year of indigenous languages.
Y también, por ejemplo, en las escuelas indígenas que llamamos, sus profesores, sus maestros, todos son indígenas.
And in these schools, all the teachers are indigenous.
Que son de la propia comunidad, no son profesores que han venido de la ciudad o no indígenas para estar en esos espacios. Hay un proceso de formación para estos profesores indígenas, para que trabajen en los idiomas indígenas, para que trabajen nuestra cultura, como por ejemplo los sistemas tradicionales de agricultura.
They are teachers from the community. They are not people from the outside that come to teach in the communities. We have a system to prepare these teachers on how to teach language and how to teach our traditional ways.
Entonces, por ejemplo, en las escuelas indígenas, en mi comunidad, por ejemplo, en la municipalidad de São Gabriel da Cachoeira,
in the municipality of
São Gabriel da Cachoeira, que es la frontera con Venezuela y Colombia.
which is at the border with Venezuela and Colombia.
Es una municipalidad donde hay 3 idiomas indígenas como lengua oficial.
In this municipality, there is 3 indigenous languages that are recognized as official languages.
También como portugués y español también porque es área de frontera.
At the same time that Portuguese and Spanish are recognized.
Entonces las escuelas indígenas de esta municipalidad, por ejemplo, tiene en comunidades donde se enseñan Baniwa, se enseña Tucano o se enseña Yengatú.
In these communities, Buguano, Tucano,
Baniwa o Yengatú, que son las 3 idiomas oficiales indígenas.
they're taught the 3 official indigenous languages.
Y esa es una política que tenemos en Brasil hoy, que también está en riesgo, pero se fue una demanda de los pueblos indígenas, del movimiento indígena por la educación.
This is a policy that right now in Brazil is at risk, but the indigenous community is already making a demand that this policy continues.
Sí, y estamos también haciendo otros cursos, otros modelos de formación para profesores indígenas y poniendo, por ejemplo, en los espacios de ensino de la graduación en la universidad, en la formación de profesores en interculturalidad, por ejemplo.
So we are also creating other systems to prepare our teachers, our indigenous teachers, and particularly for university education, and to have teachers that can teach interculturality.
Sí, porque son formaciones solamente para profesores indígenas en las universidades, para que se puedan ser profesores en las comunidades.
So in the university, there is the systems to prepare professors to teach within their communities.
Okay, so for the first question, I want to say fairly recently, within within 5 or 6 years, there has been a lot more government local initiatives to bring back traditional teaching. As a matter of fact, I think 2 years ago, there was the first traditional healing house that was built, and the government was happy to help assist in it. And, in the past, like in my grandmother's generation, God rest her soul, that would have been totally outrageous because they really bought into the American dream and the westernized and the colonial thinking. But now there's a resurgence, just like Janine had said, like there's a resurgence and there's a call for language revitalization and traditional knowledge. The education system in Guam, of course, there's private schools and it's predominantly Catholic, and then there's also the public school systems that are federally funded. And we were very blessed, really just this year, to have had a curriculum all based on the indigenous culture and language embedded into the federal system. So I think we're making really amazing progress, especially given the circumstances that we're in. And as far as building the trust, there's a lot of animosity between different peoples on Guam, whether it's Chamorros versus Chamorros or Chamorros versus the military or Chamorros versus the people who migrate into Guam. There's a lot of tension going on. I think the most key important thing, though, is to be able to get it all out and then listen when somebody else needs to get it all out. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, just maybe 2 quick questions because we have to wrap up in about 2 minutes or so.
Yeah. Hello. For me, it's I find it really interesting to see the intersectionality of culture and protection of environment in your stories and your narratives. And maybe what I'd like to ask is if you can expound on the environmental concern or programs, if you have specific environmental agenda that falls into the IP tradition and propagating traditional knowledge and practices?
I think this is a question for all. Basically, I just want to ask, what can we do in the context of clashes of rights? Because I think most of us are working usually with local communities or indigenous communities, and we are also influenced by the values, by our education, and by the organization where we work. So we always believe that we are the good people, or that we know what to do, or we need to do these things. And for example, the reason on the genetic research, because I did research last semester on this, and I interviewed some experts who are working for genetic research. They are persons who are passionately believe that this genetic research will ultimately help in addressing some of our very wicked health problems. So in that case, they're also thinking that they're right. I mean, at least they really believe in what they're doing. And this is what we are facing. So what can we do in trying to kind of also see this problem? Because rights, transparency, security, privacy, they are always good things we want, but they don't always go along with each other. I mean.
Thank you very much. And just in the interest of time, as we do need to wrap up, I invite that as just your closing reflections, sort of as well of what we can do to bring this dialogue as well back to our sort of work and movements and also collectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I can say anything to your question directly, but in general of clashing rights, I think actually what you were telling that you call the UN agencies or like a neutral mediator is already something that can be really helpful, and it is probably not done in a lot of cases. And well, I would like to invite you as well, no? And the next time you consume something, you act, or you listen to the news, to think, what are my rights and what are the rights of other people, or maybe even animals that are involved. And then you will probably see that there's more than just one right when you look at the situation from different perspectives. And we usually look at rights as something you have to fight for, that you want to acquire, that you want to become entitled to. And we usually don't see rights as something you stand down from. But I think maybe if you look at a certain situation, you will want to give up your right that harms the right of the person next to you. Or you might as well stand up for the right of the person next to you.
About expanding more on the traditional aspects, I'm happy to talk more after this session. I think to wrap it up, there's always two sides to a story. Try to see both, because I think I have at one point been too consumed with my own side, which is not always a bad thing, but it manifested a lot of resentment and even hate, and that doesn't get anywhere. It didn't get me anywhere, it doesn't get my people anywhere. And so I think if anything I could impart is just to do your best to be as open and reflective to yourself and other people. And then from there we can figure out the common good for everyone.
Also happy to talk more, and I think we already said we were going to do that. But I think in terms of like an agenda around traditional knowledge, it's about reframing this conversation about rights to responsibilities. Like, what responsibilities do we have? I think like the rights framework comes with it, with all this inherent bias and this inherent assumptions that the institutions we have to enforce or to define our rights are inherently good and effective, when in reality they're very flawed and they're based on very biased assumptions for like special interests. So like in moving forward, and this is what we're having to do in like the genetics policy, but also in all of these other conflicts, is really sit down and have a deeper analysis about who is defining what the greater good is, and like doing that exercise that I shared about like you know, what is the term that everyone's using that gets them into the room, or like the phrase, right? And the genetic research is like good for all, right? And break that down with all of the people who are in that room, because even the people who Kim with the same agenda aren't defining it the same way. And it's always a really like interesting, helpful exercise with people to figure out what are the assumptions that are going into, you know, this way we're communicating with all each other and thinking we're all on the same page. But then also going back, like you were saying, to the origins, what is the historical context for this current fight? You know, like a lot of times, I've heard this is being said here in this forum too, people are saying they don't support Indigenous rights because they're in conflicts where Indigenous peoples want to develop resources on their own land, and it conflicts with like conservationist goals or like forest preservation goals. And they don't dig deeper to like, well, why are we dependent on an economy that is extractive and that we need to actually support ourselves? Like, and why are you now inhibiting the rights of a community to participate in that economy, even though we're all trying to, you know, move forward in a different way? And then also, what is the motivation? Like, is it to protect themselves in terms of stakeholders, everyone thinking they're the good person at the table? Is it about this, is it kind of like patronizing? Is it like protection of others, like other life forms or spaces? Or is it really about collectivity? Is it really about our collective rights? And I think that that's where we're not having enough of a conversation about, is this individualistic or is this about our collective rights? Because if it really is about our collective rights, we shouldn't be clashing with one another.
Bien, cuando estamos en ese proceso de choque, de conflictos, creo que la primera cosa que debemos pensar que en cuanto a pueblos indígenas tenemos los derechos colectivos.
So when we think about rights clashing, in the case of indigenous communities, we have collective rights.
Porque, por ejemplo, en Brasil tenemos un ejemplo muy claro donde hay una comunidad de un pueblo en Mato Grosso que dice, bien, en nuestro territorio queremos hacer plantación de soja, pero sabemos el problema de la soja en los territorios indígenas, el problema de la soja como un todo.
So there's one example from an indigenous community in Mato Grosso which wants to do soy plantations in their land. And they say, we are aware of the issue with soy, but this is what we want to do.
Entonces, en este caso, el movimiento indígena a nivel de Brasil, o el mayor, está haciendo otros movimientos de decir, no queremos soja en los territorios indígenas, no queremos ese tipo de agricultura, ese tipo de desarrollo en nuestros territorios.
So the indigenous movement at national level is trying to say we don't want soy in our territories.
Porque sabemos que cuando estamos hablando de ese modelo de desarrollo en los territorios indígenas, estamos hablando de los modelos del patrón de consumo, y estamos hablando con el Estado, estamos hablando de relaciones de poder.
Because when we talk about these development pathways, we are talking about those that are imposed through the state and through, ¿qué fue lo último que dijiste?
Relaciones de poder.
And power relations.
O sea, y cuando estamos al frente, cuando estamos confrontados con las relaciones de poder, donde hay un lado de los pueblos indígenas y el otro lado el patrón de consumo, el capitalismo, sabemos que nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, siempre estaremos en una situación de vulnerabilidad.
So in this power relations where you have indigenous communities with this very aggressive consumption patterns, as indigenous people, we know that we're going to be in a state of vulnerability.
Lo que no podemos dejar es que este tipo de modelo de desarrollo sea como un modo de vida de los pueblos indígenas. Y sabemos que no es. Entonces, para amenizar ese tipo de conflicto, estamos haciendo otros tipos de movimientos y también, claro, que muchas veces nos poniendo contra a nuestros propios hermanos para decir, no es eso que queremos porque tenemos que pensar a largo plazo.
So this development model, this model of development that we're fighting against, because we know it's not the development model of our people, but even then we have to sometimes fight with discuss with our brothers that this is not what we want when we think in the long term.
Gracias.
Thank you. And the final word to Diego.
Just to stress out that I think that transparency is something very important. Our project even included a transparency platform where all information became available. But I think that the only thing that, or what ultimately led to failure is communication. I think we were not able to communicate really, and especially how to compete with misinformation. I think there's a lot of misinformation that pollutes the opinion of the people and takes us to wrong decisions. And I think that that's something that every project should really consider, the communication aspect. And also, politicians sometimes, they think in the short term sometimes, and you have to like also try to break that narrative and really make it a long-term project and really see, the long-term goal, not just the short-term.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And this is a long-term discussion. And just to reference Janine, we do need to have this conversation in community and to take our time to do it. Unfortunately, we've run out of time today and run a little bit over, but thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our speakers. And I hope that you will take this conversation forward and create that space today.